Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When my aunt left me a forgotten island in a lake, now ruled by gated luxury and HOA politics, I thought it was just peace she passed down. I was wrong. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a battlefield. And the war didn't begin with noise. It began with a letter demanding a bridge. When my aunt left me the island, most people assumed it was some eccentric inheritance joke, a sentimental patch of rock and reeds barely worth the paperwork. What I actually received was 6 acres of untouched calm in the middle of a lake that had slowly turned into a circus of gated communities, paddleboard influencers, and people who thought a jet ski was a personality. I moved fast, seized the opportunity, built a modern retreat powered entirely by solar panels, backed by battery storage and water filtration systems that made the house almost insultingly self-sufficient. For me, it was personal. My aunt used to bring me here when I was a kid, teaching me how to fish and telling me that independence wasn't about isolation, it was about control. I took that lesson literally. By the time my family and I arrived for our first proper weekend, the place felt finished in the way only something deeply earned can feel. My wife Liz walked barefoot across the deck with a mug of coffee. The kids laughed as they tested how far their voices carried over open water, and I leaned on the railing watching the sunlight drag long gold lines across the surface of the lake. From the opposite shore, Silver Bay shores looked like a polished postcard. Identical houses, manicured sand, perfect little lounge chairs lined in military rows. I noticed the glances. A few people standing near the water pointed. Someone lifted a phone. I waved casually. If you build a floating dream, people will stare. That part didn't bother me. What did bother me arrived the next afternoon, delivered by a stiff-faced courier who stepped onto my private dock as if approaching a hostile embassy. He handed me a sealed envelope with the bold header of Silver Bay Shores Homeowners Association stamped across the top and left without a word. Inside was a letter so confident in its absurdity that I actually laughed the first time I read it. They were formally instructing me to construct a pedestrian bridge from their beach directly to my island, citing a community integration initiative and enhanced recreational accessibility standards. They demanded it be completed within 48 hours and warned that failure to comply would force the association to exercise its right of access independently. There was even a suggested design aesthetic attached, complete with railings and a color palette. I reread the letter slowly, that amused disbelief draining into something colder. I was not a member of their association. My land was legally separated, registered, water rights included. I owned the lakebed under the water around my island and had verified every single detail before the property transfer finalized. And yet here was this woman, Karen Davin, president of Silver Bay Shores, informing me that my island needed to accommodate their residents as if I'd parked a food truck in their driveway. I called the number listed. A cheerful voice transferred me to Karen. She spoke like someone trained in passive aggression and scented candles, assuring me that this was simply about harmonizing development and that my island had already been included in a broader community plan. I informed her calmly that no bridge would be built and no access granted. She offered a rehearsed chuckle and told me it would be best to discuss this in person. So I did. The Silver Bay HOA office looked exactly like its personality. Glass, polished wood, photos of smiling families, and laminated plans pinned to every surface. Karen greeted me with the kind of smile people use before they invoice you for something you didn't order. Around her sat a couple of board members pretending neutrality. She explained that cooperation was expected, that the community had long envisioned the island as a shared amenity, and that resistance would not be seen favorably. I reminded her politely and very clearly that the island was private property, that I had no contractual relationship with her association, and that any effort to enter or modify my land would be treated as trespassing. Her smile thinned, her voice lowered so only I could hear it. She told me that I did not want to be the one person who refused to cooperate with the neighborhood, that Silver Bay resolved things quickly, and that people who complicated that process tended to regret it. I looked around the room, at the polished walls and carefully curated illusion of neighborhood harmony, and realized she wasn't asking. She was testing how far she could go before I pushed back. I didn't flinch. I told her exactly where my legal line stood. Then I left, walked past her perfectly symmetrical welcome sign, and returned to my perfectly symmetrical lake, already knowing this wouldn't end with a bridge. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else, purely out of habit, and stepped onto the deck to watch the surface of the lake barely ripple under a pale gray sky. The quiet was exactly what I had fought for in the first place, and I stood there for a moment enjoying the illusion that the previous day had been nothing more than a bureaucratic hallucination. Then my phone buzzed. 3 missed calls, all from an unfamiliar local number. By mid-morning, I decided to take the pontoon across to the nearest proper access point on the mainland to pick up supplies. In the past, everyone used the shared launch area that bordered Silver Bay's beach and the public parking lot behind it. It was efficient, neutral ground, or at least it had been until Karen apparently decided to start redesigning reality. As I approached the shore, something immediately looked wrong. Where there had always been open sand and a simple wooden walkway, stood a metallic gate flanked by plastic barriers and a sign that made my forehead tighten. Private HOA Beach. No mooring. Members only. I slowed the pontoon, staring at the new structure as if it might apologize and reposition itself. Instead, a broad-shouldered security guard stepped forward and motioned me away before I had even touched the dock. I raised my voice over the soft hum of the engine and explained that I wasn't attempting to use their beach, but only needed to walk through to the public lot for groceries. He didn't flinch. According to his instructions, my island now fell under the association's infrastructure plan, and my presence near the shoreline constituted unauthorized use of HOA-controlled recreational space. Then Karen appeared, as predictably as rainfall after thunder. She wore leisure clothes and a smile that seemed designed to infect the air with false civility. She held a laminated map and gestured dramatically, explaining, for the benefit of the curious cluster of residents gathering behind her, that the island had been reclassified as a shared water amenity and that my pontoon activity interfered with their quality of rest. I calmly informed her that my property status had not changed simply because she drew a colored shape around it. She responded by taking out her phone and dialing the sheriff's office, announcing that she felt threatened and that a non-member was causing disturbances by illegally mooring at their private beach. I did not raise my voice. I showed my registration, my property documents, my identification. I even offered to email copies directly to the responding officers. None of it altered the flow of the situation. A county patrol arrived, and while the deputy seemed uncomfortable, Karen's confidence was relentless. She spoke with absolute certainty, referencing community standards, unauthorized entry, improper activity. The deputy looked at my paperwork, then at her maps, then sighed the way someone does when they wish training manuals covered social warfare. He informed me that while no charges would be filed, I was being formally instructed to avoid mooring in that area until clarification of rights could be achieved. He suggested that compliance would prevent further escalation. I remember nodding, not in surrender, but in calculation. Despite the lack of criminal accusation, I was taken in briefly to provide a formal statement. 2 hours lapsed in a dull county building, while Karen likely celebrated another small victory with cucumber water and collective indignation. By the time I walked out, my disbelief had hardened into focus. That gate was not about beach organization. It was a territorial marker, and I had become the inconvenient variable in someone else's fantasy of control. When I returned to the island, I sat down in my office and opened every piece of documentation I owned on this property. The deed, the water rights, the county zoning approvals. Every layer of my ownership existed cleanly, unquestionably. It was all there, certified and exhaustively reviewed before I had even poured the first concrete footing. I sent digital copies to my attorney in Minneapolis with a short message. They're drawing my island into their HOA like it's a public lounge chair, and they just had me escorted off their water. His response came less than 10 minutes later. If they're using police for pressure and maps to rewrite boundaries, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is an attempted takeover. As I leaned back and closed my eyes for a second, the sound of distant voices carried over the lake from Silver Bay's beach, laughter and music floating across the water like nothing had happened. From their perspective, I was probably already the villain of a shared neighborhood story. From mine, the line between inconvenience and confrontation had just been crossed. By the time the sun slipped behind the western tree line, I had already stopped thinking of Silver Bay as a neighborhood and started viewing it as a coordinated organism, the kind that smiles while tightening its grip. My attorney's message kept echoing in my head, so instead of letting irritation ferment into passivity, I leaned into what I understood best: structure, evidence, and precision. I spent the remainder of the evening compiling everything: property deeds, water rights, archived survey diagrams, zoning confirmations, satellite overlays, and sent a complete dossier to Minneapolis with a note that said this situation was moving faster than polite mediation could keep up with. The next morning, my phone began vibrating nonstop. Friends, unknown numbers, even a cousin who never called unless there was prime gossip involved. Somewhere between my second cup of coffee and my first sip of sanity, I opened a local neighborhood forum and realized Karen had already begun forging a narrative. Apparently, I was the latest menace to community peace. The wealthy tech owner who had locked away shared natural resources. The man who refused to support family-friendly access to the lake. It would have been amusing if it weren't so carefully curated. What caught my attention was a private message from someone named Josh, a resident of Silver Bay Shores. He apologized for contacting me but said he couldn't stand the misinformation. According to him, Karen had sent an email blast claiming my island had always been part of a communal recreation plan and that my refusal to build the bridge posed a safety risk to children. He attached screenshots of a thread filled with half-truths and engineered concern. One woman suggested residents should pool legal funding to force compliance. Another implied my island must have been acquired illegally. I replied simply, thanked him, and asked him to keep any communication from Karen. If she wanted to run her campaign on fiction, I was more than happy to illuminate the parts she couldn't edit. Later that afternoon, my attorney forwarded documents uncovered through a formal request to the county. Among them was something labeled as an updated amenities plan submitted by Silver Bay 1 year prior. I opened the attachment and immediately noticed the manipulation. The island was shaded in a neutral gray, not labeled by owner name, presented as an undefined zone rather than what it was, a private parcel with recorded boundaries. There was language referencing historical usage by local residents. No dates, no citations, just implication disguised as history. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't ignorance, it was choreography. A selective omission here, a conveniently vague footnote there. My attorney called it what it was: an attempt to establish a fictional precedent through repetition and paperwork saturation, the type of slow burn that eventually convinces undertrained officials that something illegal has always been normal. Deciding that remaining silent would only validate Karen's propaganda, I published my own response within the local discussion board, calm, precise, unemotional. I clarified that the island had been lawfully transferred, that I owned both land and surrounding water, and that I had received an official demand from the HOA to construct a bridge into my property within 2 days. The comments exploded immediately. Some accused Karen of overstepping. Others defended her with passionate ignorance. Either way, the air was suddenly thick with attention they could no longer control. By evening, a local reporter reached out and asked if I was willing to speak about the escalating dispute. I told him not yet, but soon. There was still too much I didn't know about how far this was prepared to go. Meanwhile, within Silver Bay walls, Karen doubled down. Another email blast went out treating the situation as a minor delay in an otherwise inevitable process. She spoke of cooperation, of shared values, of vision for the future. At the bottom of her message was a clear line stating that access rights would be legally pursued if I continued to resist coordination. I closed my laptop, stepped out onto the deck, and watched the lake stretch wide and silent under the evening sky. Across the water, the boardwalk lights of Silver Bay flickered on one by one. They weren't building a bridge yet, but mentally, they had already started crossing it. The first sign that Karen had transitioned from psychological warfare to physical intrusion came before I even finished my morning routine. A low metallic thudding echoed across the water, irregular but persistent, like someone trying to drive a thought into the lake itself. I stepped onto the deck and traced the noise back to Silver Bay's shoreline, where a flat barge had appeared with men in reflective vests and heavy boots swarming across it. Hydraulic equipment leaned toward the water, and long steel shafts were being maneuvered into position with the quiet precision of people who believed paperwork would shield them from consequence. I didn't squint. I didn't wonder. I reached for the drone console and sent one straight up, its camera locking onto the activity with surgical clarity. From above, it was undeniable. They were lining up piles in a trajectory that pointed not just into the bay, but directly toward my island. I zoomed in and caught Karen standing near the edge of the beach, gesturing animatedly with a clipboard in hand, supervising like some suburban admiral commanding a fleet of power tools. I called my attorney without hesitation. He told me to document everything and not engage emotionally. That advice aged beautifully for approximately 10 seconds. I boarded my pontoon and steered toward the construction zone, keeping a careful distance as I raised my voice over the machinery and asked the crew leader what in the name of common sense he believed he was doing. He waved a laminated permit at me and explained in sterile tones that they were installing a temporary pedestrian structure authorized by the Silver Bay Association for the benefit of community safety and controlled access. Karen stepped forward before I could reply. She smiled as though this were a town fair ribbon cutting instead of a borderline invasion. She informed me that they were only constructing within what she described as community impact boundaries, and that the permanent escalation phase would be reviewed after initial structural stability testing. I told her that my land and the water around it were private, that she had zero permission, and that this exercise was trespass in a hard hat. She tilted her head and murmured something about cooperative vision and procedural inevitability. I hit the button to record on every device I owned. 2 drones now hovered, framing the site from multiple angles. I placed markers by GPS in the water to log the exact boundary lines they were ignoring. When one worker waded forward and drove a stake into the shallow ground just feet away from my rocky shoreline, I felt something in my jaw lock permanently into place. Law enforcement and county offices were notified within minutes. When the sheriff arrived, he looked like a man trapped in a conversation he never consented to. Karen handed him neatly sorted documents, her tone sugared with rehearsed composure. She insisted the work was temporary. I handed him high-resolution footage showing the stakes planted well inside my registered boundary. He exhaled, long and tired, and asked the crew to pause their operations pending clarification. The men slowed, then stopped. The lake went quiet again, but it did not feel peaceful. It felt staged. Back on the island, I uploaded everything and marked the timestamps. The drones didn't stop orbiting. Through their microphones, I later caught one worker saying something about, once the bridge is up, they can't unbuild it. That small sentence carried the desperation of a lie trying to become reality. By sundown, my attorney was drafting emergency court requests to block further work and escalate this to every department that might still remember what private property meant. Across the water, the machine stood idle like frozen threats. Karen had not built her bridge yet, but she had done something far more foolish. She had left evidence. The silence that followed the halted construction was not peace. It was simply the sound of people waiting for paperwork to catch up with ambition. I watched the abandoned equipment from my deck with the kind of focus usually reserved for unstable machinery or relatives carrying wine near white carpets. My attorney moved fast. By the following morning, a formal emergency motion had been filed requesting an immediate court order to freeze any and all construction activity within my water boundaries. The drones remained airborne, documenting every twitch on the opposite shore. Karen, however, did not retreat. Instead, she pivoted. Within 2 days, Silver Bay issued another email blast describing the situation as a temporary complication caused by overzealous interpretation of property lines. She framed it as if I were the emotional party, someone afraid of cooperation, someone allergic to progress. Her writing was impressive in its confidence, like watching a magician trying to convince you the rabbit had always been a tax auditor. My legal team began combing through every document Silver Bay had submitted in the last year. That was when the oddities surfaced. The engineering stamp on the bridge design did not align with the public license database. The signature tied to permissions matched that of a civil engineer who relocated to another state the previous year. When contacted, he expressed genuine confusion, then concern, then something close to fury when shown the scanned seal. He confirmed he had never signed off on a pedestrian structure connecting to any privately owned island. The deeper the excavation went, the more the foundation of Karen's narrative began to crumble. Property plans had been altered in subtle but precise ways. The island digitally muted into anonymity, its legal identity stripped in favor of generic shading and ambiguous labeling. The scale was not ignorance, it was architecture. Then came the anonymous email forwarded directly to my attorney. The sender did not include a name, only a statement that suggested urgency and conscience. Attached were internal communications between Karen and several board members. One message stood out like a flare. It read, "Begin preliminary operations immediately. Once physical progress is visible, we anchor the outcome. Public sentiment will follow." The anonymity did not last long. She contacted us under the name Linda, a member of the HOA board. Her voice over the phone was cautious but unafraid. She claimed Karen had been operating without transparent approval and masking significant risk to the association. She felt it had crossed from optimism into manipulation. She offered to provide testimony, documentation, and internal correspondence if we could guarantee she would not be left alone to absorb the fallout. We agreed. Within the following week, the case attracted the attention of a regional reporter who had been quietly tracking the developments. I provided limited commentary and allowed the release of selected drone footage along with excerpts from the letter that demanded I construct a bridge as if carpentry were optional obedience. The resulting news clip painted the situation clearly. Private island owner faces potential property invasion by aggressive association attempting to redefine ownership through unilateral action. Silver Bay's public response grew inconsistent. Karen issued statements about miscommunication, then doubled down on terms like sustainable development and collective benefit. Internally, panic grew. Linda followed through with more documents. Email chains revealed Karen's tone shift from absolute certainty to thinly veiled urgency. She had known the risk. She had chosen speed instead of legality. As I leaned over my desk late that night reviewing timestamps and notes, I realized this was no longer a territorial quarrel. It had become an anatomy lesson, and Karen had graciously donated the scalpel. The emergency court order arrived faster than I expected, and when it did, it landed with the weight of something that finally spoke a language Karen could not sweet talk into submission. All construction activity connected to the proposed bridge was formally suspended until ownership boundaries and permitting legitimacy could be fully reviewed. Silver Bay was instructed to maintain the current site status and preserve all documentation. In legal terms, it was a pause. In practical terms, it was a muzzle. Karen's tone shifted almost overnight. Her outer shell remained polished, but the velvet certainty had been replaced by sharp defensiveness. She began publicly suggesting that the entire situation was the result of misinterpretation of preliminary drafts and maintained that her intentions had always centered on community safety. Meanwhile, the county announced an open planning commission hearing to examine how Silver Bay had obtained authorization for shoreline construction so close to a privately held parcel. My attorney and I prepared like surgeons walking into an operating theater with full daylight and an audience. The commission meeting took place in a stark civic building that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and passive aggression. Rows of metal chairs filled quickly with curious residents, Silver Bay members, reporters, and a few individuals who seemed to have confused civic governance for live entertainment. Karen arrived with her lawyer and a thick binder held with artificial confidence. I arrived with satellite maps, survey overlays, sworn statements, and enough digital documentation to make a cartographer weep with joy. When it was Karen's turn to explain her actions, she spoke of historical usage, of safety measures, of evolving need. Her attorney framed the bridge as a response to changing recreational patterns rather than calculated encroachment. But when my counsel presented our evidence, the temperature in the room shifted perceptibly. GIS boundaries aligned on screen with clarity that was impossible to reinterpret. Drone footage presented not just proximity, but invasion. The engineer whose credentials had been quietly misused testified by video, his voice calm but pointed as he denied any involvement or authorization. Then Linda rose. She identified herself as a current member of the Silver Bay Board and spoke with composed gravity. She confirmed Karen had initiated construction without comprehensive approval, had suppressed concerns raised by other members, and that key narrative elements had been deliberately altered to streamline outcome rather than ensure legality. Equal parts controlled and cathartic, her testimony fractured what little credibility Karen had left intact. The county planning supervisor asked Karen to explain the altered documents. Her response tried to bridge confusion with charisma, but the words slipped, staggered, and regrouped awkwardly into implausibility. When asked how a private island became a neutral amenity without consent, she faltered. And when pressed on whether she had personally overseen initial construction direction, her silence spoke louder than the echo of every drone clip looping behind her. The commission ended the session with a formal statement ordering a full investigation into fraudulent permitting and the misuse of licensing credentials. Construction authority was revoked. Any future application from Silver Bay tied to shoreline expansion would require direct legal review and senior authorization. Karen exited surrounded by reporters. I left flanked by paperwork and a quiet sense of precision not usually associated with bureaucracy. Back on the island, the stillness returned, but it had changed character. It was no longer merely a buffer between me and the mainland. It had become evidence of ownership reaffirmed through procedure and clarity. Across the lake, Silver Bay looked less like a collective and more like a cracked illusion struggling to hold symmetry. Karen had tried to redirect infrastructure. Instead, she had triggered structural collapse. The legal tide turned sharply after the commission hearing, and Silver Bay's confident rhythm collapsed into frantic improvisation. I could feel it even from the distance of the lake, the way uncertainty radiates when arrogance finally meets documentation. Official letters from the county began arriving with alarming regularity, not to me, but addressing the association itself, outlining violations, procedural inconsistencies, and formal notices of review. Karen's polished newsletters ceased entirely. In their place came silence heavy enough to suggest damage control meetings being held behind locked doors and carefully frosted glass. My attorney called late one afternoon, his voice carrying an unmistakable shift in tone. The county prosecutor had formally opened an investigation into fraudulent documentation, misrepresentation of land status, and unauthorized encroachment. Karen had been named directly. Her legal counsel, previously vocal and confident, now operated with clipped sentences and delayed responses. It was no longer a zoning disagreement. It was a breach of trust complicated by criminal possibility. Silver Bay's insurance provider withdrew protective coverage after reviewing internal communications and evidence of intentional action. That simple administrative decision set off a chain reaction. The board, now fully aware of the potential liability Karen had dragged them into, began distancing themselves publicly. Emergency meetings were announced. Terms like fiduciary oversight and emergency restructuring entered their vocabulary with almost comedic panic. Linda contacted me again, this time no longer whispering. She sounded exhausted, but resolute. Karen had attempted to retain control of the board, but the members had voted to suspend her pending further legal outcomes. A motion had been filed to remove her from the presidency altogether, citing negligent leadership and unauthorized execution of high-risk projects. It was the first moment in this process where I sensed actual fracture from within. Meanwhile, my legal team prepared our civil case with surgical specificity. We claimed damages not only for construction intrusion and coastline disruption, but also for reputational impact and emotional distress caused by Silver Bay's targeted misinformation. I provided the documentation without hesitation. Every archived thread, every screenshot, every time-stamped message I had stored now carried official relevance. When Karen's attorneys approached for settlement discussion, the language they used was timid, softened, apologetic. It was a stark contrast to the confident ultimatum I had been handed on my dock weeks earlier. They proposed resolution through compensation and mutual non-disclosure. I declined immediately. This was not about money alone. This was about precedent. Court proceedings moved forward with a momentum engineered by their own missteps. Hearings unfolded like an autopsy under fluorescent light. Each evidence submission revealed the anatomy of a scheme designed to absorb private land piecemeal until ownership ceased being recognized by convenience. Testimony from the engineer confirmed misuse of identity. Linda's testimony painted Karen not as misguided, but as meticulously intentional. As I listened, legally composed but internally alert, I realized something both unsettling and oddly reassuring. Karen had never anticipated resistance. Not competent resistance, not someone with records, clarity, and refusal to flinch. Her strategy had relied on the assumption that ownership was flexible if asserted loudly enough. She had failed to calculate stubborn intelligence. By the time the hearing adjourned, it was clear this would not dissolve quietly. The judicial mechanisms were no longer circling the matter. They were descending. The verdict did not arrive with drama or raised voices. It came with the steady authority of sealed paper and measured language, the kind of finality that leaves no room for reinterpretation or performative outrage. The judge spoke slowly, as if every syllable carried the accumulated weight of the last few months. And with each sentence, it became increasingly clear that Silver Bay's fantasy had finally encountered a reality it could not repaint. The association was found to have acted with deliberate misrepresentation, having knowingly altered land documentation and advanced unauthorized construction in an attempt to enforce access to private property that had never legally belonged to them. My ownership of the island and surrounding water was reaffirmed in explicit terms, not merely acknowledged, but fortified through permanent injunction. No structure, passage, or physical intrusion would ever be permitted within a specified radius of my property without my direct consent, notarized and confirmed through judicial oversight. Karen was held personally accountable. The ruling detailed her involvement, referencing internal messages, timing patterns, and her direct encouragement of premature construction despite known boundary conflict. She was removed from any governance role and barred indefinitely from holding executive positions in residential organizations across the state. Her legal representation did not fare much better, facing disciplinary review and the suspension of license following confirmation of procedural manipulation. The association itself was dissolved, stripped of authority after a series of audits confirmed systemic mismanagement and intentional disregard for property law. Compensation was granted in my favor, covering damage to the shoreline, legal expenses, reputational restoration, and non-economic distress resulting from coercive pressure and attempted entitlement over my land. It was not the monetary figure that registered, though it was substantial, but the acknowledgement that the harm inflicted had been more than bureaucratic annoyance. It had been strategic violation. The lake quieted again as weeks passed. The construction debris was removed, the unauthorized pilings extracted, and the shoreline gradually returned to something resembling peace. But the absence of noise carried a different resonance now. It was not merely solitude, it was earned quiet. 6 months later, I returned to the mainland where the old Silver Bay beach once bristled with exclusion and false ownership. The space now fell under direct county supervision, repurposed into a transparent public park with defined access and responsible oversight. The views remained stunning, the water unchanged, but the arrogance that once dictated its use had evaporated like fog under direct sun. At the edge of the shoreline, precisely aligned where the Phantom Bridge might have once anchored its first deceitful support beam, stood a new sign. Not aggressive, just honest. Private waters. Private island. If you do not know where your property ends, do not build a bridge where you are not welcome. Local papers referenced the case frequently, labeling it a precedent for property boundary reform, for homeowner association regulation, for civil transparency. I declined most interviews. The island did not need spectacle. It needed silence, breeze, and the occasional laugh of my children echoing across open water. On a calm afternoon, I guided the pontoon gently along the edge, watching the sunlight dance across the surface, feeling again that clarity my aunt had once instilled. Independence was never about distance. It was about knowing where you stood and refusing to move when someone tried to drag you across a boundary that was never theirs to draw. It was never about the bridge. It was about the line.